that time do this, but I want to say that if we're looking for messianic shadows, which is our task this year and our privilege for that matter, and we're looking just at the beginning of this passage, then you can imagine that explaining words of Torah and teaching words of Torah are going to be bound up and part and parcel to the one who will be like unto Moshe one day, the prophet who was foretold, who was to come into the world, as some translations will render it. And you must understand something else. He's not going to say, hey, let's have a Torah lesson in the midst of our life, because our life as it is going to be entirely about Torah. You know how I said earlier, we yearn for a climate and an atmosphere when you don't have to say, let's have a Torah study, because everything you're doing is Torah study. Everything you're living is an example to your children of Torah. You are teaching them by going in and by coming out and by walking by the way and by lying down and by rising up. And you are teaching it faithfully to your children by everything you're doing. Every business transaction your children see. Every time they watch you do anything, you are teaching them Torah by living it. And therefore, to speak of Torah is not an introduction to a new slice of pie. It isn't a new spoke that we're going to now address in our particular wheel. The teaching of Torah and the talking of Torah is as natural as breathing, because it is every aspect of our life surrounded by, inundated through, and permeated with the Torah. And this is why you don't find in the Second Temple period that Yeshua stood up and said, hey, let's have a Torah study. If he had done that, it might be a lot easier for the Goyim today who gravitate toward him as the Messiah to say, oh, he did teach Torah once in a while, didn't he? Yet, what I'm about to say is provable. Everything he did was Torah. Everything he said was Torah. In other words, he did not have to preempt his remarks. He did not have to give a preface to anything he was saying. He did not have to preface his remarks, I should say, with, now let's study some Torah amid our many other activities in this community as we live our daily lives. Everything was Torah. Do you understand? I bring this up because some people point to his life and say he came to abrogate, do away with, and even supplant or replace or destroy the Torah. He came to phase in a different way, a new way. No, beloved, please understand something very clearly. He didn't preface his remarks by speaking of an introduction to Torah, because it all was Torah. And you could expect then that if we're going to find a prophet like unto Moshe, he would not introduce Torah concepts. You'll never find in the Torah itself, as Moshe is leading the people, saying to them, all right, now we've dealt with this situation. We've dealt with that situation. We've come here. Let's get together for our Torah study now, our obligatory Torah study, and let's add this to our day of busyness. Everything Moshe spoke was Torah. Do you understand that? Everything he said, everything he thought, everything he was involved in propagating, doing, all the judgments rendered upon, everything was to be a part of the template, the tapestry, as it were, of Torah. With this understanding, please understand, I understand there are congregations who are messianic in nature. There are congregations that are coming toward Torah. But I want you to understand something. Torah is what we need to live. We need to breathe. We need to think. We need to sing. Our whole being must be and permeate with Torah. Why? Because it is a very description of who God is. And our doing so honors him to do so. Many people say, what about Yeshua? Aren't you forgetting something? I mean, shouldn't your life be about him? Same thing. Do you understand that by living and breathing and focusing upon and thinking about and teaching Torah in everything we do and say, we are describing Yeshua. We are living him. He is the living version of the written Torah. Do you understand? Therefore, it isn't a choice between who we're honoring. We're honoring Hashem. That's who we're honoring. Are we clear on this?